Pam Bondi sat upright in the brightly lit CNN studio, her lips curling into a smug smile as she leaned toward the microphone. "If Africa refuses to comply with our rules," she declared confidently, "then we'll cut them off." Her voice echoed across the set, sharp and commanding, as if she were handing down a divine verdict. The camera cut to Ibrahim Traoré, seated across from her with an air of calm defiance. The young leader from Burkina Faso, dressed in his military uniform adorned with insignia earned through blood and resilience, blinked slowly. He leaned forward, not out of aggression, but conviction, and asked, "Cut us off. From what? Your chains?" Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the host stumbled for words. Pam straightened in her seat, momentarily taken aback. "Excuse me, you heard me," Traoré replied, his voice low and steady. "You mistake dependency for diplomacy. What you've offered for decades isn't partnership, it's captivity. And we're done wearing your shackles." The crowd was silent, but the tension spoke louder than any applause could. Pam tried to pivot. "Our aid, our trade, our influence." "Your conditions," Traoré interrupted, "your manipulations. You call it aid, but it comes with surveillance. You call it trade, but you set the terms. And influence, that's just a prettier word for control." The moderator cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the panel. "President Traoré, surely you recognize the role the West has played in stabilizing." "I recognize theft disguised as stability," Traoré snapped. "I recognize leaders pressured into silence. I recognize systems built to keep Africa small. But those days are over." His words didn't just hang in the air, they exploded in it. The hashtag We Cut the Chains trended within minutes. Pam Bondi sat frozen, her rehearsed power narrative unraveling in real time. And Ibrahim Traoré, he didn't gloat. He just leaned back, eyes steady on the world watching him, not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign. Outside the studio, news vans clustered like vultures. Inside, the tension between Pam Bondi and Ibrahim Traoré refused to cool. The studio lights no longer felt warm, they scorched. Pam, clinging to control, leaned in with a forced smile. "We're offering you a seat at the table, Mr. Traoré. What more do you want?" Traoré's stare could have cut through marble. "A seat at your table? No. Africa is building its own table. One where no one eats alone, and no one is told to stay hungry for someone else's feast." Pam scoffed. "You don't understand how global systems work." "No," Traoré said, "I understand them too well. I've seen how those systems turn thriving nations into debtors. How stability meant puppets in power. You speak of order, but it's built on our silence." The audience leaned in, breaths held. Pam's voice sharpened. "You're turning your back on progress." "I'm turning my face toward justice," he replied. "Your version of progress looks like plunder in a suit." The host attempted to intervene. "Mr. Traoré, some might say this rhetoric risks isolating your country." Traoré's laugh was short. "We've been isolated by design. Blocked from tech, from trade, from dignity. And now that we rise on our own terms, it's called rebellion." Pam tried again, this time with mock diplomacy. "Well, let's hope your ideals don't cost your people more than they can bear." Traoré's eyes burned with steel. "They already paid, with generations' blood. Resources. Now, at least, they'll pay for something that belongs to them." We write our own laws began trending globally. Commentators called it the awakening clip. Students, scholars, and activists across continents quoted Traoré's lines. "You call it aid, but it comes with surveillance," was now a meme, sharpened truth, gone viral. Pam Bondi, once a voice of dominance, found herself swept in a storm she couldn't spin. And Traoré, he wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. He spoke with the quiet rage of a people long buried under diplomacy's polite graves. The next day, footage of Traoré's takedown of Pam Bondi flooded every major platform. Some hailed it as Africa's new voice. Others labeled it radicalism in uniform. But Traoré wasn't scrolling reactions. He was addressing the youth of Africa in a live speech streamed from Ouagadougou's Independence Square. "Don't let them convince you your place is at their feet," Traoré declared, fists clenched, voice steady. "If they say their chains are gold, it's still slavery. If they say their rules are peace, but enforce them with weapons, it's still war. Meanwhile, Bondi appeared on a follow-up panel in Washington. He's dangerous, she warned. Charismatic but dangerous. Africa risks becoming hostile to progress. A reporter fired back, whose progress? She blinked. The global communities. And who defines that? Pam adjusted her mic. Those who built the system. In Burkina Faso, Traoré was already steps ahead. He had just signed a sweeping economic pact with Mali and Niger, cutting off all French-controlled banking intermediaries. The alliance, dubbed the New Sankara Bloc, was seen as a direct rejection of Western financial oversight. We won't be policed by the people who looted our vaults, he said. Let them keep their rules. We're busy writing freedom. Back in the States, conservative commentators exploded. Traoré is a threat to Western values, thundered one. Africa is slipping into extremism. Yet to many watching, especially young Africans and diasporas, Traoré wasn't extreme. He was honest, unapologetic. Finally speaking the unspeakable. Pam Bondi, still grasping for the narrative, tweeted, "We gave them democracy. This is how they repay us." Minutes later, Traoré responded on his official account with a single phrase. "We never borrowed it." The tweet shattered records. Over 12 million retweets in 48 hours. One user summed it up best. Pam brought a rulebook. Traoré brought receipts. Traoré had no interest in being palatable. He wasn't looking for handshakes. He was reshaping what defiance looked like. In the days that followed, Bondi's team scrambled to regain control of the narrative. She appeared on Fox, CNN, even international outlets, painting Traoré as a destabilizing force who was leading Africa into a diplomatic desert. But every time she spoke, Traoré countered, not with press releases, but with action. Burkina Faso announced a full national audit of every Western NGO operating on its soil. Traoré publicly questioned their intentions. How many wells have they actually dug, he asked. How many clinics built without conditions? It wasn't just rhetoric. A leaked document revealed that over 60% of foreign NGO funds were being funneled back to contractors in the West. The scandal exploded across African media. Pam Bondi remained silent. Traoré didn't. In a viral town hall with university students in Dakar, he said, "They sent charity wrapped in barbed wire. Every dollar was a leash. We're not ungrateful. We're unchained." His words echoed like thunder. Meanwhile, Bondi doubled down in D.C., claiming Traoré was attacking aid, but leaked footage surfaced of her private speech to donors. "If Africa doesn't follow our lead, we cut the money. Simple as that." The internet lit up. Commentators were brutal. She didn't say help. She said control. Traoré addressed it head-on in a nighttime speech under floodlights. "They never saw us as equals. Only projects. Only pawns. But we remember who we were before the maps were redrawn." That quote was printed on T-shirts, graffiti walls, and protest banners in cities from Nairobi to New York. The message was clear. Africa was no longer just listening. It was speaking, and loudly. And while Bondi paced in halls of power, trying to salvage old scripts, Traoré was busy writing new ones, on stages, in policies, in the hearts of people who'd been told to bow for generations. Washington's corridors of power buzzed with confusion. Pam Bondi had gone quiet. Behind closed doors, foreign policy advisors were scrambling. Traoré's defiance wasn't just rhetoric, it was strategic, coordinated, and relentless. And now, other African leaders were echoing his tone. Senegal halted negotiations on a Western-backed security deal. Ghana suspended a U.S. mining license. And in Nairobi, a billboard stood tall with Traoré's face and the words, "We're not your charities. We're your equals." Meanwhile, Bondi's team tried damage control. Leaked emails showed they were drafting a humanitarian sanction strategy, a plan to block aid not aligned with U.S. democratic values. But the phrase exploded online. Traoré's media team turned it into a global campaign. In a viral video, African activists read excerpts from the emails, closing with, "Democracy doesn't demand obedience. It demands dignity." Traoré himself returned to the screen days later. Dressed simply, standing in front of a mural painted by students in Ouagadougou, he said, "We don't fear isolation. We fear betrayal of ourselves." The camera lingered on him for a long beat. Then cut. Bondi tried to counter. In an emergency press conference, she accused Traoré of turning Africa into an anti-West echo chamber. But nobody echoed her back. Instead, independent African media outlets began publishing exposés. They investigated decades of foreign aid tied to political compliance, of resource deals that drained wealth while funding development. One headline read, "Aid or leash." Traoré didn't need to shout anymore. He had struck a chord that didn't just resonate in Burkina Faso, but from the townships of South Africa to the favelas of Brazil, to grassroots movements in Detroit and Brixton. In one now iconic protest in Lagos, a teenage girl held up a handmade sign. "They offered us ropes. We learned to climb with them." The tide had turned. And Pam Bondi? She found herself not just losing control of the conversation, but forgotten in it entirely. The headlines were no longer in the West's control. Traoré sparks global awakening, one African outlet declared. In Washington, Pam Bondi was asked by a reporter if she regretted her statement about cutting off Burkina Faso. She smiled stiffly and replied, "You don't reward defiance." That clip made its way to Ouagadougou within hours. Traoré, flanked by local artisans and university students, responded in a live press conference. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't use theatrics. He simply said, "They used to cut us off from our land. From our languages. From our worth. We rebuilt. We remember." Then he looked straight into the camera and added, "Cut us off from your chains. Please. We'll help." The world watched. In the streets of Dakar, murals of broken shackles started appearing. In São Paulo, activists held a vigil in honor of African resistance, quoting Traoré. In France, students from African descent flooded social media with the hashtag "We write our own laws." In response, Bondi's team tried a rebrand. She launched a campaign titled Guiding Partnerships, but it flopped within a day. Memes mocked it mercilessly. Guidance isn't consent. Chains aren't partnerships. Traoré's cultural influence exploded. Afrobeat artists sampled his speeches. A French rapper released a track titled "No Masters, No Chains," which trended across platforms. Even former heads of state began to shift their tone, calling for mutual respect and dignified diplomacy. But Traoré wasn't swayed by praise. He remained focused. In a private interview, when asked what message he had for Western leaders still clinging to control, he answered, "You can't lecture those you've wounded without first kneeling to listen." It wasn't about ego for him. It was about rewriting a centuries-old narrative. And as the movement expanded beyond Africa, into the Caribbean, into black communities across Europe and the Americas, one thing became clear. Traoré hadn't just responded to Bondi. He had reframed the conversation for a generation. By the end of the week, the West was no longer laughing. Pam Bondi's initial warning, "We'll cut you off," had boomeranged, triggering a digital uprising. But what shocked global observers more was the speed with which Traoré's response turned into a movement. In a bold move, Traoré invited African heads of state, activists, scholars, and youth leaders to a summit in Ouagadougou. The theme? From Chains to Sovereignty. The opening ceremony was electric. Delegates from over 20 African nations arrived not in suits, but in traditional regalia. Traoré, wearing a woven Burkinabe tunic, stepped onto the stage not with pomp, but with purpose. "They threatened to cut us off," he began, his voice calm, "but how do you sever something that no longer binds you?" The crowd roared. He continued. "The umbilical cord they speak of is no lifeline. It's a leash. And we've learned to breathe without it. That speech didn't just trend. It was translated into 30 languages. The African Union shared it on every official channel. Even non-aligned nations began referencing his words in diplomatic briefings. Meanwhile, Bondi's office tried damage control again. She accused Traoré of stoking division and exploiting history. But it backfired. African and diaspora scholars responded with detailed op-eds highlighting historical facts behind Traoré's remarks. In New York, a surprise protest formed outside the UN headquarters, activists holding signs that read, "Our chains are broken, don't try to fix them." The West scrambled. Think tanks released rushed papers urging new approaches to Africa. But it was too late. Traoré wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was building a new one, where those who had suffered didn't need permission to speak, and those who had ruled didn't get to write the rules anymore. And from the back row of the summit, a young girl from Ghana raised her hand during a Q&A and asked, "President Traoré, if they cut us off again, what do we do?" He smiled and replied, "Child, if they cut us off from their world, we'll build our own. And this time, we'll make sure no one's chained to it." Just 2 days after the summit in Ouagadougou, something unexpected happened. An anonymous leak exposed internal documents from a Western investment firm showing plans to freeze funding for infrastructure projects across West Africa. The language was cold, referring to Burkina Faso and other independent states as unstable zones unworthy of high-yield partnerships. The leak hit global headlines. But it wasn't just about economic retaliation anymore, it was about control disguised as aid. Traoré responded not with outrage, but with action. Standing before cameras in a crowded press room, he held up the printed document. "They call us unstable," he said, "but it is their grip that trembles, not ours." That moment went viral again. He continued, "Let them pull their funding. We'll build roads with our hands, dig wells with our shovels, and educate our youth with our truth, not their version of it." That speech reached even those who had never heard of Burkina Faso. A young activist in Kenya stitched the clip into a TikTok that amassed 12 million views in 24 hours. The West, seeing their tactics falter, tried a new strategy: delegitimize Traoré. Pam Bondi went on air again, calling him a populist with no plan. But the world wasn't buying it. Not anymore. In a surprise turn, several former African ministers, once aligned with Western institutions, publicly voiced support for Traoré. One even said, "He speaks with the fire of Sankara and the spine of Lumumba." In response, Traoré invited youth leaders to form a new Pan-African Council to oversee foreign deals, ensuring no external power could sneak their chains back in through boardroom doors. Bondi, again, warned of economic collapse. To which Traoré said, "Collapse? The only thing collapsing is the illusion of their control." From university halls in Nigeria to coffee shops in Brazil, one phrase kept echoing. "We don't fear the cut. We feared the chain." It was the morning of the referendum vote. Burkina Faso's population had been called to decide one simple question. Should our resources remain sovereign under Pan-African protection? Pam Bondi, sensing the geopolitical implications, rushed to every Western media outlet, calling it a populist stunt engineered by a dictator. But inside the country, something else was happening. Old farmers walked to voting booths with dust on their hands, mothers carried children to polling stations, and students skipped classes, not to protest, but to participate. Traoré had not only challenged the outside world, he had awakened a sleeping continent. That evening, he emerged on the balcony of the presidential building to address a crowd that stretched across the city. The sun was setting behind him, a deep orange fireball casting shadows across thousands of raised fists. They told us we were too poor to choose. They told us we were too small to matter. Today, we proved them wrong. The crowd erupted. Pam Bondi, in a televised response, warned that this would break the last thread between Africa and global stability. But Traoré smiled during his next address. If your version of global stability means exploitation without resistance, then consider the thread cut. The vote results came in 94% in favor of Pan-African sovereignty. That night, footage leaked of Western think tanks in crisis meetings. Diplomats called emergency sessions at the UN to debate how to respond to the shift in African tone. But to the people of Africa, it wasn't just a tone, it was a roar. One carved into history not with bullets, but with ballots. The final image that circulated the world was this. Traoré, walking through the streets without guards, surrounded by citizens, not followers, but equals, chanting the words. Chains off. Eyes open. In a final attempt to reassert control, Pam Bondi flew to Nairobi to meet with representatives from several African nations. Cameras flashed, speeches were made, and economic aid packages were promised, each laced with conditions carefully veiled as partnership. But Traoré didn't show up. Instead, he delivered a statement broadcast live from Ouagadougou. You cannot cut us off from chains we already broke. You cannot withhold what we never needed to survive. Pam, visibly frustrated, gave an impromptu press conference. Africa risks isolating itself from the global financial system, she warned. Such pride will cost lives. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré stood in a local market surrounded by children and vendors, waving to citizens as one of them. He wasn't behind bulletproof glass. He wasn't in a palace. He was on the ground. They fear our disobedience, he told reporters. Because obedience was their only leverage. That night, a symbolic ceremony was held in the capital. Old chains from colonial prisons were melted down and forged into a sculpture, a lion standing tall, eyes forward, with no chains around its neck, only fire at its feet. The piece was titled, Born Free, Forged in Fire. As drones captured the scene from above, Pam Bondi's televised voice echoed in the background, warning of economic consequences, potential sanctions, and global backlash. But it was drowned out by chants rising from the crowd. We do not fear isolation. We fear submission. The world watched in silence. Not because Africa was screaming, but because it no longer needed to. Its voice was steady. Its hands were firm. Its leaders, like Traoré, were no longer asking for a seat at the table. They were building one of their own.